Bring Her Back is a 2025 movie about a partially blind girl and her stepbrother who's adopted by a woman who has specific plans for them. Now, first off, before I get into this movie itself, I want to champion horror movies in general for being the only genre that is making original screenplays anymore. Like, let's look at the top 10 movies for this past weekend. Now, bear in mind, this is the summer, so arguably when people really start paying attention to the movies in the beginning of the summer blockbuster season. Now, out of the top 10 movies this past weekend, only 3 movies are original films that are not based on other existing IPs or spin-offs. Of those 3, 2 are horror movies. The only one that's not is Wes Anderson's The Phoenician Scheme. And if you want to stretch it to the top 11, it's another original horror movie called Dangerous Animals. There is another horror movie in the top 10, Final Destination Bloodlines, but that's based on an existing IP. But 3 original horror movies in the top 11, 4 horror in total. Now that's why horror is awesome. Like, it may not be making more money than the other genres, but I'll bet you the profit margins are better, and they're at least trying to give audiences a new story. Bring Her Back is the second film by the Philippou brothers after their successful Talk to Me a couple years ago. Now, I know it was announced that they would be making a Talk to Me sequel, but I was really glad to see that their next movie was an original film instead. However, I will say, when something happens once, it's not a big deal, but twice, we kind of start to see a little bit of a pattern developing, and that seems to be this brother's style. Now, my overall take on Talk to Me was that it was an excellently filmed movie with some great atmosphere and setup and some interesting characters, but its inability to follow its own rules, as well as its blurring of the rules in general, I thought held it back a bit. Now, this movie runs into a very similar situation where it sets up a clear goal and motivation for its characters, but then the way they execute the goal is a little questionable. But really only because of the either lack of information or the looseness of things that we're supposed to take at face value without any context does this become a problem. And I will say, this one handles it in a much better way than I thought Talk to Me did. There are moments in this movie where I felt like they had an idea for a scene and then changed the rules and the mechanics of the world in order to fit that scene, rather than establishing the base mechanics and adjusting the scenes to work within those mechanics. It ends up creating this squishiness that I don't particularly love. Anyway, this movie centers on step-siblings, Piper and Andy, as their father dies unexpectedly in the shower, and the two of them are fostered by a woman named Laura, who recently lost her daughter. Now, at first, she's only interested in fostering Piper, but when the kids insist on staying together, Laura agrees to take in Andy as well. Now, Andy is 17 years old, and he plans on filing for guardianship in 3 months anyway, so they're kind of expecting a bit of a short stay. When they arrive at Laura's, they find that she currently has another foster, a small boy named Oliver, who is mute. Laura's own daughter was blind and tragically drowned in a pool, so her immediate gravitation to Piper, who's partially blind, seems natural. Unfortunately for Andy, though, Laura's bristling at seemingly everything Andy does begins to show that he's unwanted in this home. They try to make the best of it, but Laura increasingly seems to help Piper while also prodding Andy and forcing him into these emotional places that he definitely doesn't want to go, specifically about the death of his father. Even though she is a counselor, her motives and tactics seem pretty questionable at best and at worst kind of devious. There's clearly something going on, not least of which is Oliver, who seemed to exhibit these increasingly more violent tendencies as the film goes on, and ends up needing to be locked in his room at times. Now, this is the setup of the film, and it's really a good one, filled with some nice mysteries, solid characters, and some good dynamics that allow the characters to kind of play off each other in a great way. From a character standpoint, Andy has a bit of a troubled past, but his love for his sister comes through so clearly, and he's willing to go along with just about anything so he can apply for custody in 3 months. Now, that also means turning a bit of a blind eye to some of the questionable behavior by Laura. Now, Laura, for her part, seems very driven by the loss of her child, and although the reason for the thing that she's doing is a mystery for a decent part of the film, she clearly has a plan and an end goal in mind. Now, some of her actions are a little bit of a head scratcher, But the movie goes through great lengths to show the emotional weight that it takes on her to do these things, justifying a greater good mentality and rationalization, as she clearly wants Piper to stay after the 3 months are up. Like, everything feels real. Although, ironically, the one character that doesn't seem to get this treatment is Piper herself, like the center of this tug of war. Now, other than her connection with her brother, she feels like a pretty empty character who's more just an item to be acquired by the other two versus a person with her own motivations and goals. Like, I never really got a sense of who she was as a person. If you take away the partial blindness element, there really would be nothing to her character other than, typical 13-year-old girl. Now, the movie does unravel the mystery, albeit I'd say maybe would have liked to have gotten a bit more information throughout versus more coming in the third act. But that's not a big problem. Actually, the bigger problem for me is once the information is all out in the open, that's where I feel like the mechanics have been altered to fit the story instead of the other way around. With the entirety of the plan revealed, some of the decisions that were made feel like someone took a real long way around to get to it for reasons that are never explained. Okay, to get into this a little bit more, I gotta talk about spoilers, so if you don't want to hear this, just skip ahead to the summation. Although the motivations made sense the way in which each person carried them out, the tasks themselves were a little confusing. Like, I'm still not sure what was needed to be done in order to finish the ritual of transference. Like, it seemed like it was just put the soul inside of a holder, have the holder eat the dead, and then transfer the soul to the new body. But if it was that straightforward, why the dragging out of everything? Now, I can understand why the games with trying to excommunicate the brother, because, once the soul gets inside of Piper, there needs to be a reason for Piper to hang around and stay. But it seemed to be carried out in such a very loose manner that I felt it was at odds with the urgency of the tasks at hand. For instance, I thought Laura was taking a ton of unneeded risks. Like, since she kidnapped a local boy to do the transference, why then foster two kids, one being a 17-year-old boy, and invite them into your home? Like, what if he recognizes Oliver? Also, he'd be a much more difficult person to control physically if you had to. I mean, I'm sure there had to be other girls that you could have fostered that are just on their own. Now, I get the connection with Piper because of her own daughter being blind, but did she have to be blind? Was that part of the ritual? Did it need to be that one for one? The idea of bringing both in and then having to try to split them apart in such a short span of time of those couple months, all while keeping Oliver at bay, feels like a bit too much. And then Oliver, who's basically a hand grenade the entire movie, is also a bit conveniently pushed aside when needed in order to get just simply the creepy kid scenes. But overall, I thought this was a really well-made and compelling film that has some interesting characters and keeps you invested all the way through. And there are some nice, creepy moments as well, and some really good gore scenes. It's a slow burn with some patient shot selection and some nice tension. The performances were all top-notch, and the lighting and music add the right amount of atmosphere to this film. Characters all have emotional weight and proper motivations, and there is an internal struggle that can be felt, and that's a direct result of the deep character design. Now, I should mention the gore a little bit more. There is a fair bit of body horror in this, and it is very well done, but certainly not for the faint of heart. So, fair warning. I do wish they'd spent more time on shoring up what needed to be done and the process of which it had to happen to understand some of the choices that were made by the characters. Because without knowing the process, it felt like it took the most roundabout route to get to where it wanted. And I think that ultimately hurts it a bit. But definitely worth a look. I'd give this movie a B+, but let me know what you think.